Jamal stood at the doorway of the classroom, barefoot and quiet, his eyes locked on the floor as whispers swirled around him. He didn't need to hear the words to know what they were thinking. Who comes to school without shoes? But what they didn't know was the burden he carried, heavier than any of them could imagine. And it wasn't just the missing shoes. Mrs. Anderson watched him closely, knowing there was a story behind those bare feet, one that no one else seemed willing to see. Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's dive in. The sound of the school bell echoed through the hallway as Mrs. Anderson greeted her class, getting ready to start another day of lessons. The usual hustle and bustle of middle school life buzzed around her. Students chatting, the soft shuffle of notebooks being opened, and the rustling of bags being tossed under desks. But today was different. Today there was a newcomer. As Mrs. Anderson turned to the door, she saw him, Jamal, the new boy. He was standing awkwardly at the threshold, his eyes cast downward, clutching the straps of his worn backpack. His clothes were clearly second-hand, a faded shirt too big for his small frame, and pants that were too short, exposing his bare ankles. But it wasn't his clothes that caught everyone's attention. It was his feet. He wasn't wearing any shoes. The murmurs started immediately. Small snickers, hushed whispers, and sideways glances ricocheted across the room. Jamal shifted uncomfortably, aware of the eyes on him, but refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Mrs. Anderson felt her heart tighten in her chest. She knew this look all too well. The look of a child who already felt out of place, but who now had the added burden of feeling judged by his peers. She had seen this before. Children were quick to notice differences, and even quicker to point them out, often cruelly. "Class," Mrs. Anderson said, her voice strong and calm. "This is Jamal. He's new here, so let's make him feel welcome." There was a half-hearted response from the class. A few students nodded, some said hello, but most were too distracted by Jamal's lack of shoes to give him a proper greeting. Anderson noticed that some of the students at the back were already exchanging looks and suppressing laughter. Jamal walked quietly to the desk. Mrs. Anderson had assigned him at the back of the room, his footsteps soft on the cold floor. He sat down quickly, placing his backpack on the desk as if it could shield him from the judgmental eyes around him. The day proceeded like any other, but there was a tension in the air. Every now and then, Mrs. Anderson would glance at Jamal, watching how he barely interacted with anyone, how he kept his head down, avoiding eye contact. She knew that starting at a new school was hard for any child, but for Jamal it seemed like an almost insurmountable challenge. As the students worked on a math exercise, Mrs. Anderson noticed two boys, Brian and Alex, whispering and pointing at Jamal. They were the class clowns, always looking for an easy target. She walked over to them, subtly but with purpose. "Brian, Alex," she said in a low voice, "do we have a problem?" Both boys immediately straightened up, shaking their heads vigorously. But Mrs. Anderson could see the smirks on their faces, the unspoken mockery in their eyes. She didn't press the issue further, not yet. Instead, she continued to observe, waiting to see how things would unfold. By lunchtime, Jamal was sitting alone at the far end of the cafeteria, poking at his sandwich. The other students had grouped off into their usual cliques, chatting and laughing, while Jamal remained isolated. No one had invited him to sit with them, and he didn't make any effort to approach anyone either. Mrs. Anderson watched from a distance, feeling a growing sense of unease. She had seen this before, a child being ostracized for something as simple as their appearance. It always started small, with whispers and jokes, but it could quickly spiral into something far worse. She knew she had to intervene, but she wasn't sure how to do it without making things even more difficult for Jamal. As the afternoon wore on, Mrs. Anderson continued her lessons, but her mind kept drifting back to Jamal. Why didn't he have shoes? Was his family struggling financially? She knew that jumping to conclusions wasn't fair, but it was hard not to wonder. She made a mental note to reach out to the school counselor later to see if they had any information about Jamal's situation. Toward the end of the day, Mrs. Anderson decided to assign a group project. She thought it might be a good way to encourage some social interaction between Jamal and the other students. She carefully divided the class into groups, making sure that Jamal was paired with students who were generally kind and inclusive. "All right, everyone," she said. "For this project, I want you to work together and come up with a creative presentation about one of the topics we've been discussing in class. You'll have the rest of the week to prepare." The students began to shuffle into their groups, excitedly discussing ideas. But Jamal's group was noticeably quiet. The other two students, Emma and Chris, seemed unsure of how to approach him. They exchanged awkward glances, neither of them making much effort to engage with Jamal. "Jamal," Mrs. Anderson called gently, "why don't you share your thoughts with your group? I'm sure you have some great ideas." Jamal looked up briefly, meeting her eyes for the first time all day. But then he quickly looked away again, nodding silently. He mumbled something about the project, but it was so quiet that neither Emma nor Chris could hear him. Mrs. Anderson felt a pang of frustration. She could sense that Jamal had a lot to offer, but he was trapped in his own shell, and the other students weren't making it any easier for him to break out of it. As the school day came to a close, Jamal quietly packed up his things and slipped out the door before anyone else. Mrs. Anderson watched him go, her mind racing with thoughts. She knew she had to do something. This wasn't just about a boy without shoes. This was about a child who was being overlooked, misunderstood, and judged based on nothing more than appearances. That evening, as Mrs. Anderson sat at her kitchen table grading papers, she couldn't shake the image of Jamal walking into the classroom, barefoot and alone. She knew there was more to his story, and she was determined to find out what it was. But how could she approach him without making him feel even more isolated? How could she help him without singling him out or embarrassing him? These were the questions that would keep her awake that night, as she prepared to make a decision that would change both her life and Jamal's. The following days were a repeat of the same uneasy rhythm. Jamal walked into the classroom, always early, and took his seat quietly in the back of the room. The other students had become more subtle in their reactions to his lack of shoes, but Mrs. Anderson could still feel the tension simmering beneath the surface. The whispering and sideways glances hadn't stopped entirely. They'd just become more hidden, more insidious. Mrs. Anderson couldn't ignore the feeling gnawing at her. There was something more to this boy, something beyond the surface, beyond the first impressions that had already shaped how his classmates viewed him. She needed to understand, but she couldn't just ask outright. Jamal was clearly a private child, someone who didn't easily reveal himself to others. On a Thursday afternoon, after the last bell had rung and the students had filed out for the day, Mrs. Anderson sat at her desk, mulling over the situation. She picked up her phone and called the school counselor, Miss Richards, who had worked at the school for years and had a reputation for knowing every student's background. "Hi, Miss Richards," Mrs. Anderson began, trying to keep her tone casual. "I wanted to ask you about one of my new students, Jamal. Have you had a chance to meet with him or his family?" Miss Richards paused for a moment, her voice thoughtful on the other end of the line. "Jamal? Yes, I've heard about him. I haven't had a formal meeting with him yet, but I did get a call from his mother when they enrolled him. It sounds like they've had a rough time recently." Mrs. Anderson leaned forward in her chair, her curiosity piqued. "A rough time? What happened?" "From what his mother mentioned," Miss Richards continued, "Jamal's father passed away unexpectedly a few months ago. It's just her and the kids now, and they've been struggling to make ends meet. She said they had to move here to be closer to her job, and it's been tough for them to adjust." Mrs. Anderson felt a weight settle in her chest. That explained so much: the quietness, the withdrawn demeanor, the lack of shoes. Jamal wasn't just dealing with being the new kid in school. He was grieving, and his family was in survival mode. She knew that the financial strain must be overwhelming, and shoes were probably the least of their worries right now. "Thank you, Mr. Richards," Mrs. Anderson said softly. "I think I understand a bit more now. I'll keep an eye on him and let you know if I notice anything else." As she hung up the phone, Mrs. Anderson sat in silence, staring out the window. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how unfair it was, how quickly people, herself included, had judged Jamal based on what they saw. His appearance had led them all to make assumptions, and no one had bothered to look beyond that. But Mrs. Anderson knew she couldn't change the past. What she could do, however, was make sure that moving forward, Jamal felt seen, not for his lack of shoes, but for the person he was beneath the surface. The next day, Mrs. Anderson made a point of speaking to Jamal after class. She didn't want to pry, but she also didn't want him to feel like he was invisible. As the other students filed out of the room, Jamal lingered behind, carefully packing up his worn-out backpack. Mrs. Anderson approached him, her voice gentle. "Jamal, can I talk to you for a minute?" Jamal stopped, looking up at her with wide eyes, a hint of apprehension flickering across his face. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. "I just wanted to check in with you." Mrs. Anderson began, trying to keep her tone light and non-invasive. "I know it's not easy starting at a new school, and I've noticed you've been keeping to yourself. I just want you to know that if there's anything you need, I'm here to help." Jamal looked down at the floor, fidgeting with the straps of his backpack. He seemed unsure of how to respond, his voice barely above a whisper when he finally spoke. "Thank you, Mrs. Anderson," he said, though he didn't elaborate any further. Mrs. Anderson waited, hoping he might open up more, but when he didn't, she smiled softly and let it go. "You're doing great, Jamal. I know this is all new, but you're handling it well. Don't be afraid to ask if you need anything, okay?" Jamal nodded quickly, muttering another quiet "thank you" before slipping out the door. As Mrs. Anderson watched him go, she couldn't help but feel a pang of frustration. She wanted to help, but she didn't want to push him. Jamal clearly wasn't ready to share much about his life, and she respected that. But still, she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that there was more she could do. That evening, as Mrs. Anderson sat at her desk at home, grading papers and thinking about Jamal, she made a decision. She couldn't just sit by and watch him struggle, but she also couldn't force him to open up to her. Instead, she would take a different approach, one that might help not just Jamal, but the entire class. She spent the next few hours drafting a new lesson plan. It wasn't just about academics, it was about empathy, understanding, and the power of community. She wanted her students to see beyond the surface, to recognize that everyone had their own struggles, even if they weren't immediately visible. The next week, Mrs. Anderson introduced the new lesson with enthusiasm. She gathered the class in a circle and posed a question that immediately caught their attention. "Can anyone tell me about a time when they felt misunderstood? Maybe someone judged you before they really knew you, or made assumptions about you based on how you looked or what you wore." The students exchanged puzzled glances, clearly not expecting this kind of discussion. One by one, though, hands started to raise. A girl in the front row talked about how people always assumed she was shy because she didn't talk much, when in reality she just preferred listening. Another boy mentioned how people often judged him for being too serious, when in fact he just liked to think before he spoke. As more students shared their experiences, Mrs. Anderson noticed something remarkable. Jamal was listening. Really listening. His eyes flickered with interest as he heard his classmates talk about feeling misunderstood. It was a small shift, but Mrs. Anderson could see that this conversation was resonating with him. When it was Jamal's turn to speak, he hesitated for a moment, glancing around the room nervously. Mrs. Anderson gave him an encouraging nod, silently telling him that it was okay to share. Jamal took a deep breath and finally spoke. "People don't really know me," he said softly. "They just see what's on the outside." The room fell silent as the students listened, and for the first time, Mrs. Anderson saw Jamal opening up, even if just a little. He didn't go into detail, but the message was clear. He felt unseen, defined only by his appearance and not by who he really was. After class, Mrs. Anderson felt a surge of hope. It wasn't a breakthrough, but it was a start. Jamal had taken the first step toward letting people in, and she was determined to keep nurturing that small flicker of connection. The following week, Mrs. Anderson couldn't shake the feeling that there was more she needed to do. Despite her efforts to make the classroom a more inclusive space, she knew that something deeper was going on with Jamal. His participation had improved slightly, but he still remained distant, particularly when it came to connecting with his peers. He kept to himself during group projects and lunch breaks, and while he had started responding in class, there was still a quiet sadness behind his eyes that Mrs. Anderson couldn't ignore. It was Friday afternoon when Mrs. Anderson decided to take the next step. She knew that if she was going to understand Jamal and offer him the support he needed, she had to get a clearer picture of his home life. She recalled her conversation with Ms. Richards, the school counselor, and how Jamal's family had been struggling since his father's death. The weight of that loss, combined with the financial difficulties his family faced, must have been overwhelming for someone so young. After school, Mrs. Anderson sat at her desk, tapping her fingers thoughtfully on the wood. She had always been cautious about visiting students' homes. She didn't want to intrude on their personal lives. But in this case, she felt it was necessary. She would approach the situation delicately, offering support without overstepping her bounds. With that resolve, she picked up the phone and dialed the number from Jamal's student file. The phone rang several times before a soft, tired voice answered. "Hello? Hi, this is Mrs. Anderson, Jamal's teacher. Am I speaking with his mother?" she asked, keeping her tone as warm and non-threatening as possible. "Yes, this is she," the woman replied, a hint of weariness in her voice. "Is something wrong? Is Jamal okay?" "Oh no, nothing is wrong," Mrs. Anderson quickly reassured her. "I just wanted to check in and see if it would be okay for me to visit. I've noticed that Jamal seems to be having a bit of a hard time adjusting at school, and I thought it might help if we could talk." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before Jamal's mother responded. "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Anderson. We've been going through a lot lately. I didn't expect anyone to reach out like this. You're welcome to come by, but I'll be honest. It's not much here." "I understand," Mrs. Anderson said gently. "I'm not here to judge, just to see how we can support Jamal better. I'll stop by tomorrow afternoon, if that's all right." Jamal's mother agreed, and after they hung up, Mrs. Anderson felt both relief and a sense of nervous anticipation. She had no idea what to expect, but she was determined to approach the visit with compassion and care. The next day, Mrs. Anderson drove to the address Jamal's mother had given her. The neighborhood was modest, the kind of place where families worked hard to get by but often didn't have much left after the essentials. The houses were small, some with peeling paint or cracked windows, but there was a sense of resilience here, a quiet dignity that came from people doing their best with what they had. She parked her car in front of a worn-down, single-story house with a small, patchy lawn. The mailbox leaned slightly to one side, and the front steps were chipped and uneven. Still, the house was tidy, with a few flower pots lining the porch, their blooms brightening the otherwise weathered exterior. Anderson took a deep breath before stepping out of the car and walking to the door. She knocked lightly, and after a few moments, the door creaked open. Jamal's mother stood there, looking just as tired as she had sounded on the phone, but she smiled warmly. "Mrs. Anderson, thank you for coming," she said, stepping aside to let her in. "Thank you for having me," Mrs. Anderson replied, offering a kind smile as she walked into the small living room. The inside of the house was clean but sparse. The furniture was old and worn, but everything was neatly arranged. Mrs. Anderson noticed that the curtains were drawn, allowing only a sliver of sunlight to filter into the room. There were a few framed photographs on a shelf. Jamal as a baby, Jamal with his father, and one of the whole family, taken before the weight of loss had settled over them. "Please, have a seat," Jamal's mother said, motioning to a small couch. She sat across from Mrs. Anderson, her hands folded nervously in her lap. "First of all, I want to say that Jamal is a wonderful student," Mrs. Anderson began, hoping to ease any tension. "He's quiet, but I can tell that he's very intelligent. I just wanted to reach out because I've noticed that he seems withdrawn. I know it's not easy being the new kid, but I also know that sometimes there are other things going on that can make school even harder." Jamal's mother sighed softly, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and pride. "It's been difficult since we lost my husband," she admitted. "Jamal was very close to him, and after the funeral, it's like a part of him just shut down. We had to move here to be closer to my job, and I've been working 2 shifts just to keep us afloat. I try to be there for my kids, but it's hard when you're always exhausted. I know Jamal feels the weight of it, even if he doesn't say it." Mrs. Anderson nodded, her heart aching for this family. I can only imagine how hard it's been, she said softly. Jamal hasn't mentioned any of this at school, but I can tell he's carrying a lot on his shoulders. He doesn't like to talk about it, Jamal's mother explained. He's always been quiet, but after his father passed, it's like he stopped trusting people. And then there's the fact that we don't have much. I know the other kids probably notice. Mrs. Anderson hesitated for a moment before addressing the topic that had been on her mind. I did notice that Jamal doesn't have shoes. I wasn't sure if it was something I should bring up, but I just want to make sure that he has what he needs. A look of embarrassment crossed Jamal's mother's face, and she quickly shook her head. It's not that we don't want to get him shoes, she said, her voice filled with frustration and guilt. It's just that, right now, we have to prioritize rent, food, and other things. I've been meaning to buy him shoes, but every time I think I'll have the money, something else comes up. He doesn't complain, though. He just deals with it. Mrs. Anderson reached out and placed her hand gently on Jamal's mother's arm. You're doing everything you can, and it's clear that you're a good mother. I understand how difficult it is to balance everything. Please don't feel like you have to apologize. Jamal's mother smiled weakly, her eyes filling with unshed tears. Thank you, she whispered. It's hard not to feel like I'm failing them sometimes. You're not failing, Mrs. Anderson reassured her. You're providing them with love, and that's more important than anything material. But if you'll allow me, I'd like to help. I don't want to overstep, but I think there are ways the school could provide some support, whether it's through donations or community programs. We could make sure Jamal gets what he needs without making him feel singled out. Jamal's mother hesitated for a moment, clearly conflicted between accepting help and maintaining her pride. But after a long pause, she nodded. If it helps Jamal, then yes, I would appreciate that. Mrs. Anderson smiled, feeling a sense of relief. We'll take it one step at a time. I want to make sure Jamal feels supported, not just by the school, but by his classmates as well. He deserves to feel like he belongs. They spoke for a while longer, discussing ways to subtly provide Jamal with what he needed while preserving his dignity. As Mrs. Anderson prepared to leave, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just a teacher, she was part of a community, and she had the power to make a difference in this boy's life. As she stepped out onto the front porch, she glanced back at the house one last time. Jamal had so much potential, and she was determined to help him realize it. More than anything, she wanted to show him that he was more than just the boy without shoes. He was a person of value, someone who deserved respect, kindness, and understanding. Monday morning arrived, and the air in the classroom felt a little different. Mrs. Anderson walked through the door with a renewed sense of purpose, ready to set her plan in motion. She wasn't just thinking about Jamal anymore. She wanted to address something broader, a culture shift within her classroom that could ripple outward. She had seen how prejudice and small judgments had affected not only Jamal, but also how the other students interacted with one another. There were walls everywhere, some built from economic differences, others from race, others simply from misunderstanding. As the students settled in, Mrs. Anderson stood at the front of the class, her usual warm smile on her face. Good morning, everyone. Before we dive into our lesson today, I have something special I want to talk to you all about. The students, who had grown accustomed to Mrs. Anderson's occasional detours from the traditional lessons, sat up a little straighter, their curiosity piqued. We've been learning a lot about history, social studies, and how societies function, Mrs. Anderson continued, her eyes scanning the room. But there's something that we don't always talk about in the classroom, and that's how we treat each other. She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. Some students exchanged confused glances, while others like Emma and Chris, who had worked with Jamal in the group project, seemed to sense where this might be going. I want to start a new project, something that will help us understand each other better, Mrs. Anderson said, walking slowly around the classroom. It's called the Empathy Project. Several hands shot up immediately. The students were intrigued, but they weren't quite sure what this meant. What's empathy, Mrs. Anderson? Asked a girl sitting in the front row. Great question, Emily, Mrs. Anderson replied. Empathy is the ability to understand and share the feelings of others. It's about stepping into someone else's shoes, figuratively, of course, and seeing the world from their perspective. Jamal, sitting in the back, shifted in his seat slightly at the mention of shoes, though he kept his gaze firmly on his desk. Mrs. Anderson caught the subtle movement, but continued without drawing attention to him. For this project, I want each of you to think about a time when you felt misunderstood or judged for something you couldn't control. It could be something big or something small. Whatever comes to mind. Then I want you to create something that expresses how that experience made you feel. It could be a story, a drawing, a poem, or even a song. The goal is for us to share these experiences and learn to understand one another better. The room was quiet for a moment as the students processed what she had said. Slowly, hands started to rise again, and Mrs. Anderson called on them one by one. "But what if we can't think of anything?" one student asked. "Don't worry, Jacob," Mrs. Anderson replied with a smile. "It doesn't have to be a dramatic experience. Even small moments of feeling left out or misunderstood count, and if you're really stuck, we can work together to come up with something." Another hand went up. "Do we have to share it with the class?" Mrs. Anderson nodded. "Yes, sharing is part of the project, but I want you all to know that this classroom is a safe space. No one will judge you here. We're all going to listen to each other with open minds and open hearts." The students seemed reassured by her words, and after a few more questions they started working on their projects. Mrs. Anderson could see them thinking deeply, scribbling notes or doodles in their notebooks. Even Jamal, who often kept his head down during activities like this, appeared to be engaged, though he was still cautious and quiet. Over the next few days, the students worked on their empathy projects, and as the deadline approached, Mrs. Anderson could feel the anticipation building hard. She had arranged for the presentations to take place on Friday, giving the students time to prepare, but also setting a clear expectation that everyone would participate. As Friday arrived, the classroom felt different once again. This time, it was filled with a quiet sense of anticipation. The students sat in a semicircle at the front of the room, their projects in hand, ready to share their stories with their peers. Mrs. Anderson took a seat among them, choosing not to stand at the front like a traditional teacher, but instead to sit as part of the group, creating an atmosphere of equality and openness. She started the session by sharing her own experience of feeling misunderstood as a child, explaining how she had been shy and often mistaken for being uninterested or aloof, when in reality she had simply been nervous around others. Her story set the tone for the rest of the class, and one by one, the students shared their own experiences. Some were lighthearted. A boy talked about being teased for liking ballet, and a girl shared how people often assumed she was rude because she didn't smile much. Others were more emotional. Emily, who had asked about empathy earlier in the week, opened up about how people had judged her for her speech impediment, which had taken her years of therapy to overcome. As the stories unfolded, something remarkable happened. The students, who had previously been so quick to judge or dismiss one another, began to see each other in a new light. There were no whispers, no laughter, just quiet attention and nods of understanding. They were beginning to understand that everyone carried their own burdens, even if those burdens weren't always visible. When it was Jamal's turn to present, the room grew even quieter. Mrs. Anderson could sense the shift in energy, the way everyone was holding their breath, waiting to hear what he would say. Jamal stood up slowly, his hands trembling slightly as he held up a small drawing. It wasn't elaborate, but it was powerful, a pair of feet walking along a path, with stones scattered along the way. Some of the stones were sharp, jagged, and clearly painful to walk on, while others were smooth and gentle. "This is about how I feel sometimes," Jamal began, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's like I'm walking on a path that's harder than other people's. Some days, the stones are sharp, and it hurts, but I keep walking because I have to. And sometimes people see me walking on the stones and they think I'm different or strange, but they don't know that the stones are there." The room was utterly silent. Mrs. Anderson felt a lump forming in her throat as she watched Jamal speak. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of someone who had been walking through life, carrying more than his fair share of challenges. When he finished, Mrs. Anderson stood and walked over to him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Thank you, Jamal, for sharing that with us. Your drawing is powerful, and your story reminds us that we don't always see the challenges others are facing." Jamal nodded, looking down at his feet, and for the first time Mrs. Anderson noticed a subtle change in the way the other students were looking at him. There was no judgment in their eyes, no mockery, only understanding. The rest of the empathy projects continued, but the tone had shifted. The students were no longer just going through the motions. They were deeply engaged, reflecting on what their peers had shared, and more importantly, learning to see each other as more than just surface-level impressions. In the following days, Mrs. Anderson began to notice small but significant changes in the classroom dynamic. Jamal was no longer sitting alone at lunch. Emma and Chris, who had previously struggled to connect with him during group work, now invited him to join their conversations. There was no grand gesture, no sudden flood of friendships, but there was something deeper. A quiet acceptance, a shared understanding that had started to break down the invisible walls between them. Jamal, for his part, seemed lighter. He still had his moments of quiet reflection, but he participated more in class, raising his hand to answer questions and offering his ideas during group discussions. He even started sketching in his notebook during free time, sharing his drawings with the classmates who had once ignored him. But the most significant change, in Mrs. Anderson's eyes, was the way the students had begun to look out for one another. They were more patient, more willing to listen, and more aware of how their actions and words affected those around them. The empathy project had done more than just teach them about each other. It had begun to change how they viewed the world. One afternoon, as Mrs. Anderson walked through the hallway, she overheard a conversation between two students from another class. They were talking about Jamal, but this time it wasn't in the usual hushed, judgmental tones. Instead, they were praising his artwork, commenting on how talented he was. Mrs. Anderson smiled to herself, feeling a sense of pride not just in Jamal, but in her class as a whole. They had learned something that couldn't be measured by tests or grades. They had learned to see each other as people, with stories, struggles, and strengths of their own. As the days turned into weeks, Mrs. Anderson watched with quiet pride as her classroom continued to transform. The empathy project had been more successful than she ever could have imagined. What had started as an exercise to encourage understanding and compassion within her class had rippled outwards, affecting not only Jamal but the entire group of students. Jamal had become more than the quiet, withdrawn boy who had walked into the classroom on that first day without shoes. He was no longer defined by his bare feet or his worn-out clothes. He was now Jamal, the boy with the incredible talent for drawing, the boy whose calm demeanor and sharp observations made him a valuable member of the class. Slowly but surely, his classmates had come to see him for who he truly was, and not for what he lacked. But the most striking change wasn't just in Jamal. Mrs. Anderson noticed that the students were kinder to one another in general. The small cliques and subtle divides that had existed before had started to fade. There was less teasing, less judgment, and more cooperation. Students who once kept to themselves or had been isolated were now included in conversations and activities. The classroom had become a place where everyone was seen and heard, regardless of their background or circumstances. One afternoon, as the class worked on an art project, Mrs. Anderson called Jamal to her desk. He walked up, his usual calm expression masking the curiosity that flickered in his eyes. "Jamal," Mrs. Anderson began, "I wanted to talk to you about something important. There's a school-wide art competition coming up, and I've seen how talented you are. I think you should enter." Jamal blinked, clearly surprised. "Me? In an art competition?" Mrs. Anderson smiled. "Yes, you. You've got a real gift, Jamal, and I think you should share it with the world. Your drawings have something special, something that makes people stop and think. I've already spoken to the organizers, and they'd love to see your work." Jamal hesitated, shifting from one foot to the other. "I don't know," he murmured, glancing down at his hands. "I've never really done anything like that before. I understand, Mrs. Anderson said gently. "It can be scary to put yourself out there, but I believe in you, and I know your classmates would support you too." Jamal was silent for a moment, clearly thinking it over. Finally he nodded, a small but determined smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Okay," he said, "I'll try." Over the next few weeks, Jamal threw himself into his artwork. During free periods and lunch breaks, he would sit in the corner of the classroom, sketching furiously. Mrs. Anderson would often catch glimpses of his work, abstract but full of emotion, a blend of bold lines and delicate details that spoke of the inner world Jamal had kept hidden for so long. The other students began to notice too. Instead of the usual whispers and stares, they started gathering around Jamal's desk, curious about what he was creating. At first, Jamal had been shy about sharing his drawings, but as more and more students complimented his work, he began to open up. It wasn't long before his classmates were asking him for drawing tips, admiring his technique, and even asking if he could draw something for them. By the time the art competition deadline approached, Jamal had completed a piece that he felt truly proud of. It was a large, intricate drawing of a tree growing through a cracked sidewalk. The roots twisted and tangled beneath the surface, struggling to find their way through the obstacles, while the branches reached skyward, full of life and promise. The drawing was both beautiful and symbolic, a reflection of Jamal's own journey, growing and thriving despite the difficulties in his path. The day of the competition arrived, and Mrs. Anderson could see the nervousness in Jamal's eyes as they entered the auditorium where the artwork was displayed. Dozens of students from across the school had submitted pieces, and the walls were lined with paintings, drawings, and sculptures of all kinds. Jamal's work stood out, though, not because it was bigger or more colorful, but because it had a depth and meaning that drew people in. As the judges made their rounds, Mrs. Anderson stayed close by Jamal's side, offering quiet encouragement. She could see the tension in his posture, the way he kept glancing at the other students' work, as if doubting whether his drawing belonged among them. But she knew that what made Jamal's work special wasn't just his technical skill. It was the heart behind it. When the awards were finally announced, Mrs. Anderson held her breath. The first few categories passed by without Jamal's name being called, and she could see the disappointment beginning to settle in his eyes. But then, as the judge announced the winner for Best Overall Art Piece, Mrs. Anderson's heart skipped a beat. And the winner is Jamal for his piece Resilience. There was a brief pause as Jamal processed what he had just heard. Then slowly the realization dawned on him. He had won. The auditorium erupted in applause, and for a moment Jamal looked as if he wasn't sure what to do. Mrs. Anderson gave him a gentle nudge, and he stood, his face a mixture of shock and pride. As Jamal walked up to the stage to receive his award, Mrs. Anderson felt a swell of emotion. This was more than just a victory in an art competition. It was a victory over the doubts, the judgments, and the struggles that had weighed Jamal down for so long. He was finally being seen for who he was. A talented, thoughtful, and resilient young man. After the ceremony, Jamal was surrounded by his classmates, all of them congratulating him and admiring his artwork. Even students who had once ignored or mocked him were now eager to celebrate his success. But what stood out most to Mrs. Anderson was the way Jamal carried himself. He wasn't the shy, uncertain boy who had walked into her classroom months ago. He was standing taller, his shoulders back, and there was a quiet confidence in his eyes that hadn't been there before. In the days that followed, Jamal's newfound confidence continued to grow. He began participating more in class discussions, offering insights that surprised even his classmates. He took on leadership roles in group projects and even started tutoring a few students in art during lunch breaks. The transformation was remarkable, but it wasn't just Jamal who had changed. The entire classroom dynamic had shifted. Mrs. Anderson watched as the students supported one another in ways they hadn't before. There was a sense of camaraderie, a shared understanding that had developed over time. The empathy project had been the catalyst, but the students had carried that lesson forward, applying it to their everyday interactions. They had learned to look beyond the surface, to see each other's strengths and struggles, and to offer kindness instead of judgment. One afternoon, as the class wrapped up a lesson, Jamal approached Mrs. Anderson's desk, his art award tucked under his arm. He hesitated for a moment before speaking, his voice soft but clear. "Mrs. Anderson," he began, "I just wanted to say thank you. For everything. For believing in me when I didn't believe in myself." Mrs. Anderson smiled, her heart full of pride. "Jamal, you've done all the hard work. I'm just glad I got to witness your journey." Jamal nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "It feels different now," he said after a moment. "I feel like I'm finally being seen for who I really am. Not just, the boy without shoes." Mrs. Anderson felt a lump form in her throat. "You've always been more than that, Jamal. I'm just glad the world is starting to see it too." As Jamal walked back to his seat, Mrs. Anderson took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the journey they had all been on. It hadn't been easy. There had been moments of doubt, frustration, and sadness. But in the end, the empathy, the understanding, and the connection they had built together had created something lasting. Something that would stay with these students long after they left her classroom. By the end of the school year, the changes in Jamal and his classmates were undeniable. What had started as a simple act of empathy, a teacher reaching out to a student in need, had turned into something far more profound. Jamal had found his place, not just in the classroom, but within himself. He had learned to trust others, to express himself, and to walk with his head held high. As Mrs. Anderson packed up her classroom for the summer, she found herself reflecting on the journey they had all taken together. She knew that not every story ended like this, that many students would continue to face struggles and challenges in their lives. But she also knew that the lessons of empathy, kindness, and resilience would stay with them, shaping the way they moved through the world. In the quiet of the empty classroom, Mrs. Anderson smiled to herself, knowing that this was what teaching was truly about. It wasn't just about grades or tests or lesson plans. It was about seeing the humanity in each student, about helping them find their voice, and about showing them that they were more than the labels the world might place on them. And as she turned off the lights and closed the door, Mrs. Anderson felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had made a difference, not just in Jamal's life, but in the lives of every student who had learned, through their shared experiences, what it meant to truly see and be seen. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.